Hello, and in this video I'm going to be looking at how realism and the Gothic interplay in two books, specifically Mary Elizabeth Braddon's Lady Audley's Secret and Richard Marsh's The Beetle. Both of these are from the Victorian era. Braddon's text is from about 1862, I think, and Marsh's came out in 1897, same year in fact that Dracula came out. Lady Audley's Secret depicts a female attempting to go beyond the boundaries of what is allowed or permitted her, and ultimately people seeing that assertion as almost in its form of insanity, or certainly punishable in the same way as in the Victorian era. The Beetle, on the other hand, is a story about a creature with certain powers, supernatural and hypnotic, and it stalks a British politician and is in search of vengeance for what was done to certain tombs in Egypt. It embraces a number of genres, most notably the travelogue and the murder mystery. Now, obviously, before we can get into the discussion of how Gothic and Realist interplay, we need to have some sort of definition of what those two terms mean, and I'm going to be using the definition of Gothic by Professor John Bowen, which is from his essay, which is available via the British Library on the web, and it considers a handful of motifs embraced by novels generally described under the Gothic umbrella. He also makes clear that they don't necessarily have a single trait in common, but they have overlapping characteristics, motifs and traits, a concept that mirrors Amanda Claybore's description of realism as a syndrome. Texts, she says, qualify as realist if they manifest enough of the symptoms, but any discussion of a genre as resistant to definition as realism must invariably seek to answer the question of what is realism. Is it, as George Eliot asserts in Adam Bede, a mirror held to the world, or is plausibility enough, as Thackeray implies in his autobiography? Well, I'm going to be taking the definition used in this book, which is the Victorian novel. It's the second edition. Be warned if you have the first edition that the essay that I'm using by Amanda Levine is not in the first edition. But she describes realism under four subheadings. They are subjects, plots, objects and perspectives. Particularly, these need to be grounded, contemporary and observable. But if I focus on just two of those, objects and subjects specifically, then this video won't be 3 hours long. And we're going to show that the Gothic and the Realist traditions actually interplay in such a way that it's almost as if they are feeding off each other. Now, according to Levine, one of the main features of a realist novel is an attention to material objects. Cynthia Wall attributes this to a consumer culture that was exploding at the time of the Victorian authors particularly. It's brought about largely by industrialisation. And there are examples of this in the opening pages of Lady Audley's Secret, the strange clock at the beginning that is always at extremes, and the broken wheel from the well. Indeed, the novel begins with a lengthy description of the grounds and buildings of Audley Court that is so packed with detail as to represent a tour de force of realism. To the right, there were the kitchen gardens, the fish pond, and an orchard bordered by a dry moat, and a broken ruin of a wall, in some places thicker than it was high, and everywhere overgrown with trailing ivy, yellow stonecrop, and dark moss. But in that same passage, the realism is entwined with numerous hints of the Gothic, particularly the reference to the previous nunnery on the site and dangerous, cruel days when the life of a man was in danger if he was discovered to have harboured a Roman Catholic priest or to have had mass said in his house. The building itself takes on a supernatural flavour. Braddon's narrator tells readers that Audley Court is a place visitors fell in raptures with, feeling a yearning wish to have done with life, and that its labyrinth corridors and secret passages could trap unwary visitors if ever you were so rash as to attempt to penetrate its mysteries alone. But perhaps the most striking object in the book is the portrait of Lady Audley herself. Braddon seems to side with Dickens, who was a critic of the pre-Raphaelite movement, when she says of the painter, "I'm afraid the young man belonged to the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood." This allusion to what in 1862 was still a relatively new movement makes the painting seem modern and therefore more real, as does the suggestion that the painting is unfinished. Even irrelevant objects that feel real, according to Roland Barthes, add to the text's sense of realism. There is a hint of Freud's uncanny, with it was so like and yet so unlike, and Alicia's fancy that we have never seen my lady look as she does in that picture, but I think that she could look so. Here we see Braddon weaving Gothic motifs into a realist description of a very real-seeming object. Marsh repeats this twisting of realist objects into the uncanny with his depiction of the Beetle's rug, in particular Marjorie Linden's first encounter with it. As one continued to gaze, one began to wonder if by any possibility the creatures could be alive. The rug takes on extra significance later as the Beetle has extraordinary difficulty travelling across modern London. He's slowed by the rug and identified by it at every turn. One witness says my attention was called to him by his insistence on taking the bundle with him into the carriage, and another, I didn't never have a proper look at him, but I know he had a blooming great bundle on his head. The Beetle is a novel often described in terms of reverse colonisation, and here Marsh appears to be using the encumbrance of the rug as a metaphor for the baggage of history. The rug is tied intrinsically with England when Robert Holt first encounters it. It reminded me, somehow, even then, of the turf in Richmond Park, but it thwarts the Beetle every step of his travels. Given the Beetle's links to Egypt, it seems possible that this is commentary on the Suez Canal, and particularly Britain's muddled diplomacy and thinking around it, having initially opposed the building of it, then heavily invested in it, and then eventually invading Egypt to control it. While Braddon inserts hints of the uncanny into what is otherwise a very realist description of Lady Audley's portrait, and Marsh takes this a step further in his own tale, it is clear that both are subverting realism's fascination with material objects to create a sense of unease and firmly establish their novel in the now. That contemporary subject is one of Clayborne's main criteria of realism, and both Braddon and Marsh embrace this. In Lady Audley's Shadow, Saverio Tomaglioli's book on the Lady Audley secret, he draws parallels between the fictional Lady Audley and a very real figure called Lady Rosina Wheeler, who was imprisoned on various dubious charges of insanity in 1858. The unpleasant fate that befalls Helen Talboys / Lady Audley towards the end of Braddon's novel may well be based on a true story, but there's no doubt that she ends up in a significantly Gothic location, a great mansion of grey stone with several long ranges of windows, many of which were dimly lighted and looked out like the pale eyes of weary watchers upon the darkness of the night. Despite its considerable commercial success, Lady Audley's Secret fared little better with the critics of its time than any of the other sensation novels, yet much of the criticism in the Reader's Review centres around the objectionable nature of the title character. The author of the piece, that's credited only as E.D., decries especially the assumption that we can feel interest in a woman who commits every breach of moral and divine law. Victorian critics considered such subjects as both the cause and effect of societal corruption, and Braddon is most definitely subverting that with her description of Lady Audley, with her disordered hair and a pale haze of yellow gold about her thoughtful face, the flowing lines of a soft muslin dressing gown falling in straight folds to her feet, and clasped at the waist by a narrow circlet of agatelings. It might have served as the model for a medieval saint. And this description displays no technical disparity with George Eliot's own description of Adam Bede. The broad chest belonged to a large-boned, muscular man nearly 6 feet high, with a back so flat and a head so well poised that when he drew himself to take a more distant survey of his work, he had the air of a soldier standing at ease. The difference that so unsettled the Victorian critics, then, is not in the description of the characters, but rather in their actions and the plot. Yet, knowing of her grounding in reality, it is difficult to level an accusation of a lack of realism at Lady Audley. Indeed, for the reviewer in The Reader, it isn't a lack of realism that elicits so much scorn, but rather too much of it. We should be sorry to see the day when the plots of English novels were taken from the revelations of our divorce courts. Likewise, Marsh builds his novel on the contemporary. By 1897, the concepts of evolution proposed by Charles Darwin and Herbert Spencer had permeated much of political and social thinking, which, along with challenges to Victorian and Christian morality by the aesthetic movements, influenced Max Nordau's book Degeneration, in which he argued that society had passed its zenith and begun to decline. Marsh uses a number of Gothic motifs to illustrate this degeneration in the Beetle, the most striking of which is Robert Holt's personal degeneration. Holt is reduced to what Augustus Champnell describes as a deplorable spectacle when he completes his journey through a Gothic-tinged location. Here Marsh substitutes London for more exotic fare, but his description would be equally at home in the slums of Milton or remote Transylvania. I seemed to be leaving civilization behind me. Houses were few and far between. Those which I did encounter seemed, in the imperfect light amid the general desolation, to be cottages that were crumbling to decay. Marsh's tale of Paul Lessingham's experience of bloody sacrifice and perverted sexual desires, a Gothic staple according to Bowen, and at the hands of the cult of Isis in Egypt, this would have satisfied audiences excited by tales from around the empire, but it would also have felt very real as newspapers brought back tales of atrocities and violence, real and exaggerated, from Africa. And The Beetle was published in 1897, the same year in which the British Empire annexed Benin. In both instances, though, Marsh is subverting a realist motif, contemporary settings and issues with the Gothic traits of sexual power and the exotic locations. And as we've seen, the depiction of Lady Audley became so troubling to Victorians because it was so plausible. By convincingly occupying the role Gothic novels traditionally reserved for the mysterious, supernatural and male villain, Lady Audley challenges preconceptions in a way that Margaret Hale, for example, the protagonist of Elizabeth Gaskell's North and South, for all her independence, does not. As Tom Audley says of such characters, it is their plausible motivations which make them more dangerous and credible to the critics. If shocking audiences with ugly content was, as Levine states, an aim of realism, then by mixing contemporary issues and real situations with Gothic devices, we can see Braddon and Marsh doing the very same in their texts. What this all means is that Mary Elizabeth Braddon and Robert Marsh subvert the real with the Gothic to different extents in their work, but by doing so they prove that neither tradition is pure. Braddon and Marsh use realism techniques of description and the realist fascination with material objects to create a sense of mystery or foreboding that is charged with Gothic uncanny. Both use Gothic-seeming locations, but eschew the mystery of foreign lands in order for more familiar domestic locations. Braddon even symbolically burns down the castle on the hill, and both tie these locations to modern social and political issue on the basis of plots that embrace Gothic tropes. Braddon's attack on the lack of women's rights is coupled with a bewitching villain, while Marsh tackles themes of empire and race in a tale laced with the ancient foreign magical powers. So when Lukács and Saw insist that realism is a response to profound social and economic upheavals, it finds an absolute echo in Professor Bowen's observation that Gothic novels appear at times of political or social crisis. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe for more. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.